All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that honestly, I think it's safe to say affects every single one of us, time, and more specifically, how we use it. And, I've been going through all this stuff that you guys have sent in, all these different perspectives, and wow, there's a lot to unpack here. It seems like we're all kind of on this quest to figure out how to make the most of our time, right? To go beyond just the usual time management stuff and find some really, truly useful insights.
Yeah, I noticed that too when I was looking through everything. It really seems like there's this common thread running through it all, this idea of like shifting away from just, going through the motions of our days and instead becoming way more intentional about how we actually spend our limited hours.
Totally. It's so easy to just get swept up in it all, right? The work, the chores, maybe a little too much social media scrolling. And, before you know it, another day is gone, and you never really stop to ask yourself, wait, is this actually how I want to be spending my life?
Hmm.
And one thing from the material that really hit me hard, it was this statistic, this fact that the average human lifespan is only about 4,000 weeks. Like, that's it. And if you're around 40, well, you've already used up more than half of those weeks. It's a bit of a wake-up call, isn't
Oh
it?
yeah, for sure. A big one. And that's what we're going to really dive into today. It's not about like squeezing more tasks into your day or anything like that. It's about stepping back and really rethinking what actually matters, what holds real value when it comes to how we use this incredibly finite resource, this time that we have.
Exactly. And we've got some really fascinating stuff to explore today. We're going to talk about why time seems to speed up as we get older, which is this whole thing called the time perception paradox.
Yeah.
And then there's that sneaky trap of putting things off till someday, the whole art of figuring out what truly deserves our attention and why experiences often end up enriching our lives so much more than like material possessions. So, ready to get started?
Oh yeah, definitely. I'm really intrigued by that first one you mentioned, that whole time perception paradox thing.
Right. Okay. So let's unpack that a bit. So from what I understand, the material kind of suggests that our brains, they don't really track time like a stopwatch or anything. It's more about how many new experiences we're having.
Exactly, and it's tied to our memory, right? Like think about how different your experience of time was when you were a kid. Summers felt like they lasted forever, didn't they?
Oh my gosh, yes. Seriously, a single week felt like it stretched on and on and on. And now it's like poof, entire months just vanish. It's crazy.
And a big part of that, from what the sources say, is because when we're kids, we're constantly being bombarded with new information, right? Everything is new sights, sounds, tastes, everything. Our brains are working overtime just trying to process it all. And all that intense processing, that's what creates that feeling of time slowing down.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I always think about it like driving somewhere you've never been before. That journey always feels way longer because you're paying attention to all the new stuff around you. But then, like your daily commute, it just seems to disappear.
Right, because your brain already knows that route. Right. It's got a map of it, so it doesn't have to work as hard to process all that new information. What's really cool here, and this goes a little deeper, is that research has actually shown that new experiences, novel experiences, they create stronger, more detailed memories in our brains. And because how we perceive time is so closely linked to our memories, a period filled with new experiences, well, it ends up feeling longer in retrospect too, because we have all these vivid memories to look back on. So the takeaway here, the practical thing you can actually do is to actively try to seek out new experiences, things you haven't done before, to make your experience of time feel richer and more expansive.
So what you're saying is like if I shake things up a bit, do things differently,
Yeah.
that can actually make it feel like I have more time.
Exactly. Even small changes can make a difference, like taking a different route to the grocery store, trying a new hobby. Just little things to inject some spontaneity into your week.
I like that. There was actually a story in one of the sources that really illustrates this. It was about this person who decided to take like a salsa dancing class. And even though they felt a little awkward at first, outside their comfort zone and all, those 2 hours were so packed with new sensations, new information, that the entire day felt longer and more memorable.
It's like you're telling your brain, hey, pay attention, this is something new and exciting. So it really does work.
It's amazing how much power we actually have over how we experience time.
Yeah.
Now, something else that really stood out to me from the material was this whole concept of the illusion of someday.
Ah, someday. That magical land where we'll finally do all those things we've been putting off.
Exactly. It's like, I'll start learning Italian someday. I'll finally write that book someday. I'll take that dream trip to, I don't know, the Galapagos Islands someday. But then someday never actually seems to arrive.
You know, the sources actually have this great way of describing someday. They call it the comfy couch of procrastination. Like, it feels good to imagine doing all those things in the future, but it also keeps us stuck, right? It prevents us from actually living those experiences and achieving those goals. It's this mental barrier that keeps us in a state of just constantly putting things
It's
off.
like waiting for all the traffic lights to turn green before you even leave the house. You'll be waiting forever.
And that brings up a question for you, the listener. How often do you find yourself using that word someday? If it's a lot, the sources offer some really practical advice. The key is to replace that vague someday with an actual date, like a real specific date, even for small things. So instead of thinking, I should really call my friend someday, make it, okay, I'm calling Sarah on Saturday afternoon.
I see what you mean. You're turning that vague intention into a concrete plan. So it's not someday I'll read that book, it's I'll read the first chapter of that book before dinner on Thursday. Giving it a deadline, even a small one, makes it feel so much more real and achievable.
Exactly. And even better than that, the sources say, is to actually start taking tiny steps today, like right now. They call them micro actions. You want to learn to play guitar, go watch one YouTube tutorial. That's it, just one. Thinking about getting in shape. Take a 10-minute walk right now. Just 10 minutes. It's all about creating that initial momentum. Often, the hardest part is just starting. So if you break things down into really small, manageable steps, it suddenly doesn't seem so overwhelming.
It's kind of like once you get that ball rolling even just a little bit, it becomes easier and easier to keep going. You build up that momentum. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, let's talk about this idea of prioritization. Because with all the demands on our time these days, it can be really tough to figure out what actually deserves our attention.
This is something I think everyone struggles with. We're constantly bombarded with work, emails, notifications, and a lot of it feels so urgent, even if it doesn't really line up with our big picture goals.
And that's where this deathbed test comes in, which, okay, I know it sounds a little morbid, but honestly, it's a pretty powerful way to think about things.
Yeah, it's intense, but it really cuts through all the noise, you know?
Yeah.
The idea is to imagine yourself at the very end of your life, looking back. What are the things that are going to matter to you then? The memories, the relationships, the things you accomplished. Will you be lying there wishing you'd spent more time answering emails? Or will you be wishing you'd spent more time with your loved ones or pursuing your passions?
Wow, that's heavy stuff. Really puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Suddenly all those daily stresses and to-do lists just seem, well, kind of insignificant.
Right. And once you have a better sense of those big picture priorities, the material suggests this really practical strategy, the top 3 priorities rule. So every day, you just pick the 3 most important things that absolutely have to get done that day. Those become your non-negotiables. That way, you can filter out all the less important stuff and focus your energy where it really counts.
That's a great system. It's manageable. And another key part of this whole prioritization thing, as the sources point out, is learning to say no to things that don't align with those top priorities, especially those time wasters that can suck up huge chunks of our day.
Totally. And the sources specifically call out social media as a major culprit here. It's so easy to fall into that endless scroll, and before you know it, you've lost an hour. And those constant notifications, that urge to check what's happening, it just fragments your focus and makes it hard to really concentrate on the things that matter.
Oh, tell me about it. You pick up your phone for like 2 minutes and suddenly it's been an hour. It's insane.
The material offers some good tips for managing those distractions, though. The first step is just to become aware of what your personal time wasters are. Once you know what they are, you can start setting some boundaries. Turn off non-essential notifications. Set specific times for checking email or social media. Small changes like that can make a huge difference. It's about consciously choosing where you focus your attention instead of letting it get pulled in a million different directions.
Right, taking back control. And when you do that, the sources say you often find that you have way more time than you thought for the things and the people that you really care about. And this actually leads into another important point that the material talks about. The idea that investing your time and experiences is often way more rewarding than focusing on just accumulating things.
This is a really key distinction. The sources talk about how experiences tend to create lasting memories and really contribute to our personal growth in a way that material things, while maybe fun for a little while, often don't.
Like, think about it. That expensive gadget you were so excited to buy last year, How much do you even use it now? How much joy does it really bring you? Now, compare that to like a memorable road trip you took with friends or a concert that gave you goosebumps. Which one has had a more lasting impact on your life?
Exactly. The sources even use some specific examples, like a designer purse that ends up sitting in a closet versus a cherished memory of taking a cooking class with a loved one. Experiences create stories. They become part of who we are. They offer opportunities to connect with people, to learn, to grow, in a way that just buying stuff never really can.
Right. It's like time invested in experiences pays dividends in the form of memories and personal growth,
Hmm.
whereas time spent acquiring things often provides just this fleeting sense of satisfaction that fades pretty quickly. Okay, now let's talk about something that I think we don't really talk about enough. The value we place on time versus money. The material really digs into this, and it's pretty eye-opening.
It is interesting, isn't it? Like, we're so careful about saving money, tracking our spending, sometimes down to the penny, but then we let hours and hours of time slip away without even really thinking about it.
Like the sources make this analogy that we would never just throw cash in the trash,
Hmm.
right? But we're totally okay with wasting hours on things that don't really bring us joy or value.
Yeah.
It's kind of a weird disconnect, isn't it?
It is. And the big difference the sources point out is that you can always earn back money, but you can never, ever get back time. Once it's gone, it's gone. It's truly a non-renewable resource, which, when you really think about it, makes it even more valuable than money.
This leads into this idea of time wealth. It's not just about how much money you have, but also about how much control you have over your time. Like, do you have the freedom to choose how you spend your hours?
Exactly. The sources use this example of someone who has a high-paying job but works crazy long hours. So they might have a lot of financial wealth, but they don't have much time wealth. They don't have the freedom to really enjoy their life, to spend time with their family and friends, to pursue their hobbies. It highlights this trade-off that often exists.
It makes you think about what kind of wealth you're really aiming for, right? Is it just about money, or is it about having the freedom to do the things you love?
The sources describe time as like a blank canvas. The more control you have over your time, the more you can intentionally create the life you want. Speaking of intentionality, let's talk about single tasking. This was another big takeaway for me from the material. It really challenges that whole idea that multitasking is like the key to productivity.
Oh, yeah. It's like we've all been brainwashed to think that being able to juggle a million things at once is something to be proud of. But the sources make a really good case for why that's actually not true. They say that multitasking actually increases our stress levels and makes us less productive overall.
Right. When you try to do multiple things at once, you're basically splitting your focus, right? You're not giving your full attention to anything. And that leads to more mistakes, lower quality work, and just this general feeling of being overwhelmed and not really getting anything done.
It's like trying to cook dinner, answer emails, and watch TV all at the same time, which, okay, I admit I've definitely tried to do before. And the result is usually burnt food, half-written emails, and just a feeling of, ugh, why am I even doing this?
Yeah. It's a recipe for disaster. The sources contrast that with the benefits of single tasking, of focusing on just one thing at a time. They say that when you do that, not only is it usually a more enjoyable and less stressful experience, but you also tend to get better results and feel more accomplished.
So it's like, instead of spreading yourself thin, you're concentrating your energy, and that leads to better outcomes. Okay, now the material talks about this strategy that, okay, I'll admit, it sounds a little bit tedious at first, but it seems like it's super valuable. Keeping a time log.
Yeah, it might not sound like the most exciting thing, but it's really eye-opening because, most of us don't have a really accurate sense of how we're actually spending our time. The sources talk about how there's often this big gap between how we think we're spending our time and how we're actually spending it.
It's kind of like when you track your spending, right?
Mhm.
You might have a general idea of where your money goes, but until you actually write it down, you might be surprised by some of your spending habits.
Exactly. It's like shining a light on your daily routines. The sources say that if you track your time for even just a week, you'll start to see patterns. You might notice that you're spending way more time on certain activities than you realized, or that there are all these little time wasters that are adding up without you even noticing.
And once you see those patterns, that's when you can start making changes, right?
Mhm.
The material gives an example of someone who realized they were spending an hour a day on social media, just mindless scrolling. Once they became aware of that, they were able to cut back and use that extra hour for something more meaningful.
It's really empowering, isn't it, to realize that you have more control over your time than you think. Now, as we talk about making the most of our time, there's something else that's super important, and it's something that a lot of people overlook: rest.
Oh, yeah. It's easy to think of rest as like unproductive, or even lazy. But the sources really emphasize how important it is, not just for our well-being, but for our productivity too.
Exactly. They talk about rest as a productivity booster. Like, it's not just about recovering from work, it's about recharging your batteries so you can actually function at your best.
It's like, think about your phone. You wouldn't expect it to work properly if the battery was completely drained, right?
Yeah.
We need to recharge too. The sources even suggest scheduling downtime into your calendar, like literally treating it like an important appointment.
That's a good strategy because if you don't intentionally make time for rest, it often just doesn't happen. And when we don't get enough rest, our focus suffers, our energy levels drop, and we're more likely to burn out.
Right, rest is essential. It's not a luxury. And to make sure we're staying on track and actually using our time in a way that aligns with our values, the sources emphasize the importance of regular reflection.
Yeah, just taking you minutes each day to think about how you spent your time, to ask yourself if those activities were actually in line with what's most important to you. It's a simple practice, but it can make a huge difference.
It's like a little check-in with yourself,
Yeah.
a way to make sure you're not just living on autopilot.
Ah,
Okay, and then finally, the sources talk about this practical strategy that can really help to reduce stress and just make life more enjoyable. Time buffers.
yes, time buffers, those little pockets of unscheduled time that you build into your day. The sources talk about how overscheduled days are like a row of dominoes, like one little thing goes wrong and the whole thing falls apart. But when you have some built-in flexibility, some breathing room, it makes everything so much easier.
It's in those unscheduled moments that some of the best things happen, right?
Yeah.
Get a chance to pause and think, to do something spontaneous that brings you joy, or to deal with unexpected problems without feeling totally overwhelmed.
Exactly. So to sum it all up, what the material is really saying is that using your time wisely isn't about cramming more and more into your day. It's about creating a more balanced, intentional, and meaningful life. It's not about the quantity of time, but the quality of how you use it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So to recap the main points from all those amazing sources you guys sent in, prioritize what really matters to you. Build in time buffers so you have some flexibility and space for rest. And make time for those meaningful experiences that truly enrich your life. That's the real recipe for creating a life you love, a life you're excited to wake up to every day.
And as you go about your day, I encourage you to think about all the things we've talked about today. How do they resonate with your own life? How are you choosing to spend your precious time?
Yeah, take some time to reflect. And here's one final thought for you to chew on. What's one small change you could make today, right now, to be just a little bit more intentional with your time? Maybe it's breaking a routine, finally scheduling that thing you've been putting off, or just taking a few minutes to figure out what your top 3 priorities are for tomorrow. Whatever it is, take that first step. You won't regret it.